the scent of burning parchment mixed with the morning mist as 17-year-old Isadora pressed her face against the cold window of her cell. Below in the courtyard, Sister Agatha was hastily feeding papers to a small fire, her usually composed face twisted with panic. But what caught Isadora's attention was not the destruction of evidence, but the man emerging from the shadows of the bell tower, adjusting his robes with suspicious haste. Father Benedict, the confessor who had arrived 3 months ago with promises of spiritual renewal. The same priest who now seemed to appear wherever the most beautiful sisters happened to be praying alone. Isadora had entered the convent of Saint Celestine only 6 weeks ago, sent by her family to avoid a scandal involving a married merchant and a very public kiss. She had expected silence, prayer, and perhaps some decent bread. Instead, she had discovered a world where whispered confessions carried more intrigue than any court gossip, and where the line between divine ecstasy and earthly pleasure was drawn in invisible ink. The convent sat perched on a hill overlooking the village of Montclair, its grey stone walls weathered by centuries of secrets. Within these walls lived 43 women, each carrying stories that would make a tavern-keeper blush. There was Mother Superior Benedetta, whose iron rule masked a past involving 3 different lovers and a mysterious fortune. Sister Cordelia, the herbalist, whose remedies could cure both heartache and inconvenient pregnancies, and Sister Violante, whose mystical visions occurred with remarkable frequency whenever young. Father Benedict was within hearing distance. The morning bell had barely finished tolling when Isadora noticed movement in the herb garden. Sister Marguerite, the fugitive nun who had already attempted to escape, was crouched behind the rosemary bushes, apparently in deep conversation with someone hidden behind the garden wall. Even from her window, Isadora could see the flash of metal that suggested weapons, and the hurried exchange of what looked suspiciously like a bundle of clothes. This was not the peaceful sanctuary her parents had described. "Sister Isadora, your meditation is required in the chapel." The voice belonged to Sister Caterina, the silent governess whose pale eyes seemed to catalogue every transgression. But there was something different about her today, a flush to her cheeks and a hastiness to her step that suggested her own morning had been far from contemplative. As Isadora made her way through the cloistered corridors, she passed the chamber where Sister Violante was allegedly experiencing another divine vision. The sounds emerging from behind the heavy wooden door were certainly passionate, though whether they originated from celestial or terrestrial sources remained debatable. The rhythmic creaking of what might have been a prayer bench suggested Sister Violante's communion with the divine was particularly vigorous this morning. In the chapel, Father Benedict stood before the altar, his sermon flowing like honey over the assembled sisters. He spoke of temptation and resistance, of the flesh and the spirit, all while his eyes lingered on the younger novices with an intensity that had nothing to do with salvation. Isadora noticed how Sister Elena, the letters keeper, clutched a folded parchment against her breast, her knuckles white with tension. How Sister Agatha kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone. How Mother Superior Benedetta watched it all with the calculating gaze of a merchant evaluating her wares. "Temptation," Father Benedict intoned, his voice caressing the word like a lover's whisper, "comes to test our faith. But we must remember that the greatest victories are won not in avoiding temptation, but in embracing our struggles." The double meaning was lost on no one. After the service, as the sisters dispersed to their daily duties, Isadora lingered behind. She had developed a talent for becoming invisible, a skill that served her well in a place where secrets were currency and knowledge was power. She watched as Father Benedict approached Sister Elena, his hand brushing hers as he accepted the folded parchment. She saw Sister Violante emerge from her chamber, her veil slightly askew and her cheeks flushed with what she claimed was holy fervor. She observed Sister Marguerite slip through a side door, her escape attempt apparently successful this time. But it was the conversation between Mother Superior Benedetta and Sister Caterina that made Isadora's blood run cold. "3 of them," Mother Superior whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of morning prayers, echoing from the distant chapel. 3 sisters showing signs. We cannot hide this much longer. The herbs are working for 2 of them, Sister Katerina replied, her pale hands clasped tightly. But Sister Magdalena refuses the remedies. She claims her condition is a blessing that will see us all burned as heretics if the bishop discovers it. Isidora pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. 3 pregnant nuns. A mother superior more concerned with reputation than morality. And somewhere in this maze of stone and secrets, a truth that could destroy them all. As the conversation continued, detailing arrangements for discreet relocations and convenient illnesses, Isidora began to understand that the convent of St. Celestine was not a sanctuary from the world's corruption. It was a masterclass in it. And she, the naive novice from a merchant family, had just enrolled in a curriculum that could cost her everything, including her life. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the courtyard where Sister Agatha had burned her secrets. But some secrets, Isidora was beginning to learn, refused to stay buried. The revelation of the previous morning had left Isidora sleepless, her mind churning like a mill wheel. As she prepared for morning prayers, she noticed Sister Magdalena's absence from the chapel, confirmed by the hushed explanations of illness and rest. But illness, Isidora now knew, was often a convenient euphemism within these walls. The dining hall buzzed with undercurrents of tension. Sister Cordelia, the herbalist, moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, but Isidora noticed how certain sisters received additional portions of particular foods, herbs disguised as seasonings, remedies hidden in plain sight. The knowledge made the simple act of breaking bread feel like participating in a conspiracy. Father Benedict entered the hall during the meal, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Spoons paused halfway to mouths. He moved through the room like a predator among prey, offering blessings that felt more like assessments. When he paused beside Sister Elena, placing his hand on her shoulder in what appeared to be pastoral comfort, Isidora saw the woman's entire body tense. Sister Elena has been struggling with doubts, Father Benedict announced to the room, his voice carrying the authority of divine judgment. She requires additional spiritual guidance. We will meet privately after Vespers to address these concerns. The words were proper, the tone appropriate, but the way Sister Elena's face drained of color suggested these private meetings involved more than theological discussion. Several of the older sisters exchanged meaningful glances, their silence speaking volumes about what they knew and chose not to say. After the meal, Isidora volunteered for kitchen duties, hoping to learn more from Sister Cordelia. The herbalist worked with quiet intensity, grinding roots and mixing tinctures with the precision of an alchemist. When they were alone among the hanging bundles of dried plants, Isidora ventured a careful question. Sister Cordelia, I have been experiencing feminine difficulties, irregular cycles. My mother always said such things were signs of spiritual imbalance. The older woman looked up sharply, her dark eyes assessing. And what remedies did your mother suggest? Prayer and fasting. But I wondered if perhaps some herbal preparation might also help. Sister Cordelia set down her mortar and pestle, studying Isidora with new interest. There are many herbs that can regulate a woman's natural rhythms. Pennyroyal for cleansing, tansy for restoration, rue for ... renewal. Each word was carefully weighted, loaded with meaning beyond the botanical. And if a woman discovered herself with child, despite her vows? The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Sister Cordelia's hands stilled completely, her gaze becoming sharp as a blade. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant chanting from the chapel. Such a woman would face choices, Sister Cordelia finally whispered. Difficult choices. Some herbs that heal can also ... undo. But such knowledge is dangerous. The Church considers it witchcraft. The Inquisition has burned women for less. Before Isidora could respond, Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Sister Cordelia quickly resumed her grinding, and Isadora busied herself with washing bowls. But the conversation had opened a door that could not be easily closed. Later that afternoon, while copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, Isadora overheard a conversation that made her quill tremble in her hand. Sister Caterina was speaking in low tones with Sister Agatha, their voices barely audible above the scratch of writing implements. "The merchant from Florence has agreed to take her," Sister Caterina murmured. "He believes she is a young widow seeking a new start. The gold he paid will cover her passage and provide enough for the child's care. And if she speaks of this place, she understands the consequences. Besides, her reputation is already compromised. Who would believe the word of a fallen woman against the integrity of a holy order?" Isadora's hand jerked, leaving an ink blot on the sacred text she was copying. Sister Magdalena, she realized, was being sold like a commodity. Her pregnancy, her disgrace, her very identity were being negotiated like goods in a marketplace. The cold efficiency of it made her stomach turn. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the courtyard, Isadora made a decision that would change everything. Instead of attending Vespers, she slipped away from the other sisters and made her way to the abandoned tower at the convent's eastern corner. The structure had been unused for decades, its stone stairs worn smooth by countless feet, its chambers filled with nothing but dust and whispered legends. But as she climbed the narrow spiral staircase, she heard voices echoing from above, familiar voices engaged in conversation that was distinctly unfamiliar for a house of God. "You promised me protection," Sister Elena's voice, tight with desperation. "You said, if I remained silent about the others, you would ensure my safety. And I have kept that promise," Father Benedict replied, his tone carrying an undertone of threat masked as reassurance. "But silence, my dear sister, requires constant renewal. Faith demands ... demonstration. I have already given you everything you asked for, the letters, the confessions, the knowledge of who comes and goes. What more can you possibly want?" The answer came not in words, but in the sound of fabric rustling, of footsteps moving closer, of a woman's sharp intake of breath. Isadora pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would betray her presence. "Faith is not a single act of devotion." Father Benedict's voice was closer now, intimate and commanding. "It is a daily surrender. Tonight, as before, you will demonstrate your commitment to our ... spiritual arrangement." The implications of what she was overhearing crashed over Isadora like cold water. Father Benedict was not just hearing confessions, he was collecting them, using them, creating a network of compromised women who bought his silence with their bodies and their complicity in his larger schemes. Sister Elena's response was barely audible, a whispered acquiescence that spoke of resignation rather than desire. And in that moment, Isadora understood that the convent of Saint Celestine was not just harboring scandals, it was orchestrating them. Father Benedict had transformed the sacred act of confession into a tool of manipulation, and every sister who entered his confessional emerged as either a victim or an accomplice. As footsteps began to descend the stairs, Isadora pressed herself deeper into an alcove, praying to saints she was no longer certain were listening. But even as she hid in the shadows, she knew her days of innocent observation were over. She had learned too much, seen too much, understood too much. In a place where knowledge was both currency and curse, she had just become one of the wealthiest and most endangered residents of the convent. The game had changed, and Isadora was no longer just a player, she was a target. 3 days had passed since Isadora's discovery in the tower, and the weight of knowledge pressed against her chest like a stone. She moved through her daily routines with mechanical precision, attending prayers, copying manuscripts, and taking meals, all while her mind raced with the implications of what she had learned. Every interaction with Father Benedict felt like walking across ice that might crack at any moment. Every glance from Sister Elena carried the desperate weight of a woman drowning. But it was the arrival of the new novice that truly tested Isadora's resolve. Sister Francesca was perhaps 19, with golden hair that caught the light even beneath her veil and eyes the color of spring violets. She had been sent from a noble family in Venice, officially for spiritual formation. But the whispered conversations Isadora overheard suggested a more familiar story. A scandal, a hastily arranged marriage that fell through, a family eager to place their daughter somewhere respectable while memories faded and reputations could be rebuilt. What made Francesca's arrival particularly troubling was Father Benedict's immediate and obvious interest. During her first confession, Isadora heard him speaking to the girl with a tenderness that made her skin crawl. By the second day, he had arranged for private theological instruction. By the third, he was finding excuses to appear wherever Francesca happened to be praying, studying, or walking in the gardens. Isadora recognized the pattern now. She had seen it with Sister Elena, with Sister Violente, with others whose initial enthusiasm for spiritual life had gradually transformed into something darker and more desperate. Father Benedict was a hunter, and young novices were his preferred prey. The realization demanded action, but what kind of action was safe in a place where the very person meant to offer spiritual guidance was the source of corruption? Speaking to Mother Superior seemed pointless, given her complicity in hiding pregnancies and arranging disappearances. Approaching Sister Caterina would be like confessing to an executioner, and the other sisters were either victims themselves or too frightened to act. That afternoon, while working in the herb garden, Isadora found herself alone with Sister Cordelia. The herbalist had been teaching her to identify medicinal plants, but their lessons had taken on new meaning since their conversation about more dangerous remedies. As they worked among the rows of healing herbs, Isadora carefully broached the subject that had been consuming her thoughts. Sister Cordelia, what would you say to someone who discovered corruption within our walls? Someone who witnessed things that contradicted our sacred vows? The older woman's hands stilled among the mint leaves she was harvesting. I would say that such a person faced a choice between courage and safety, and that history judges harshly those who choose safety when courage could save others. But what if speaking out would endanger not just oneself, but innocent people? What if silence protected some while condemning others? Sister Cordelia straightened, wiping soil from her hands with deliberate care. Then such a person would need to find a way to act that minimized harm while maximizing truth, perhaps by seeking allies, perhaps by gathering evidence, perhaps by finding someone outside these walls who had the power to intervene without being compromised by the very corruption they sought to address. The suggestion was subtle but clear. Within the convent, the rot had spread too far to be excised from within. External intervention would be required. But approaching the local bishop seemed dangerous, given his close relationship with Father Benedict and his financial interest in maintaining the convent's reputation. The Inquisition was even more terrifying, likely to burn first and ask questions later. That evening, as Sister Francesca joined them for Vespers, Isadora watched the girl's face during Father Benedict's sermon. There was still innocence there, still trust, but also a kind of breathless attention that suggested she was already falling under his influence. After the service, when Father Benedict approached the new novice with an offer of additional spiritual guidance, Isadora knew she could not wait for perfect solutions or safe opportunities. She had to act. The next morning, Isadora volunteered for duties that would take her to the village market. Such excursions were normally supervised, but Sister Agatha was distracted by preparations for a visit from church officials, and Isadora's reputation as a dutiful novice allowed her to slip away with minimal oversight. Once in the village, she made her way not to the market stalls, but to the small monastery that housed the traveling scholars who occasionally visited the region. Brother Marcus was a Franciscan monk known for his learning and his discretion. He had visited the convent several times to consult their library, and Isadora had assisted him in locating particular manuscripts. More importantly, He had struck her as a man whose commitment to truth exceeded his loyalty to institutional politics. She found him in the monastery's scriptorium, bent over a treatise on canon law. When she requested a private conversation about matters of spiritual concern, he agreed with the kind of gentle attention that gave her hope. "Brother Marcus," she began carefully, "if a person discovered behavior within a religious house that contradicted sacred vows and endangered innocent souls, what would be the proper way to address such concerns?" His eyes sharpened with interest and concern. "That would depend on the nature of the behavior and the position of those involved. But generally speaking, the welfare of innocent souls must take precedence over institutional reputation." Encouraged by his response, Isadora began to share what she had witnessed and overheard, carefully omitting names while providing enough detail to convey the seriousness of the situation. Brother Marcus listened with growing alarm, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated both his understanding of the legal implications and his genuine concern for the people involved. "These are serious accusations," he said when she finished. "If what you describe is accurate, it represents not just moral corruption, but canonical crimes that could result in excommunication and civil prosecution. But accusations require evidence, testimony, documents. More than the word of a single novice, however credible. Then what would you suggest?" Brother Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing multiple considerations. "There will be a formal visitation by the diocesan authorities within the month. If certain evidence were to come to light during that inspection, it would force an investigation that could not be ignored or suppressed. But gathering such evidence would be dangerous for anyone involved." As they spoke, a plan began to form. Brother Marcus would use his legitimate access to the convent's library to return within the week, ostensibly to complete his research. During that visit, if certain documents were to be made available to him, or if he were to witness certain behaviors, he would be obligated to report them to the appropriate authorities. It was not a perfect plan. It was not even a safe plan, but it offered a chance to expose the corruption before more innocent women like Sister Francesca were drawn into its web. And for Isadora, who had entered the convent seeking sanctuary from scandal, it represented something she had never expected to find within its walls, a purpose worth risking everything. As she made her way back to the convent that afternoon, Isadora knew that she had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. She was no longer simply observing the scandals of Saint Celestine. She was actively working to expose them. The naive girl who had arrived 6 weeks ago was gone, replaced by a young woman who understood that sometimes faith required not submission, but rebellion. The evening bells were tolling as she approached the convent gates, their bronze voices calling the sisters to prayer. But Isadora carried with her a different kind of calling now, one that would either save the innocent or destroy them all. The transformation was complete. The student had become the strategist, and the real test of her courage was about to begin. Brother Marcus returned to the convent exactly 1 week later, as promised, carrying with him the weight of Isadora's revelations and a carefully constructed plan. His arrival was announced during morning prayers, and Isadora felt her stomach clench as Father Benedict's voice faltered momentarily in his blessing. The priest's eyes swept the assembled sisters with new suspicion, as if sensing that the winds of change carried threats he could not yet identify. "Brother Marcus honors us with his continued research," Mother Superior Benedetta announced after prayers, her voice carrying its usual authority but with an undertone of wariness. "He will be consulting our manuscripts on canonical law. Sister Isadora, you will assist him, as before, given your familiarity with our collection." The assignment was exactly what they had hoped for, but it placed Isadora in immediate danger. As she led Brother Marcus to the library, she could feel eyes watching from every shadowed alcove. Sister Caterina followed at a distance, her pale face more vigilant than usual. Even Sister Alina, emerging from what was undoubtedly another private conference with Father Benedict, watched their passage with nervous intensity. The library was a sanctuary of sorts, its high vaulted ceiling and walls lined with centuries of accumulated knowledge. But as Isadora and Brother Marcus began their carefully choreographed research, they were interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Sister Francesca entered carrying an armload of manuscripts, her golden hair catching the filtered sunlight from the high windows. "Father Benedict asked me to deliver these commentaries on spiritual discipline," she said, her voice carrying the breathless quality of a young woman already half in love with her confessor's attention. Brother Marcus accepted the manuscripts with scholarly politeness, but Isadora saw his sharp gaze take in the girl's flushed cheeks and the way her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the texts. When Sister Francesca lingered, clearly hoping for conversation, he gently suggested she return to her duties. After she left, he turned to Isadora with grim understanding. "She is the one you spoke of, the new novice, yes. And I fear we may already be too late to save her innocence." Their research that morning was deliberately focused on canonical law regarding the punishment of corrupt clergy, a choice designed to send a clear message to anyone who might be observing. But their real work began during the afternoon recess, when most sisters retired to their cells for rest and private prayer. Isadora led Brother Marcus through passages she had learned to navigate in darkness, guiding him to positions where they could observe without being seen. Their first stop was the herb garden, where Sister Cordelia was meeting with a woman from the village, a pale creature who clutched her stomach and wept as the herbalist pressed a small cloth bag into her hands. "Drink this tea at dawn and dusk," Sister Cordelia whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The bleeding will come within 3 days. Tell your husband it is woman's weakness, nothing more." Brother Marcus absorbed this exchange with the careful attention of a man building a legal case. The selling of abortifacient herbs was a serious crime, one that could result in excommunication for Sister Cordelia and charges of witchcraft for the convent as a whole. Their second observation post was near the abandoned tower, where Isadora had first overheard Father Benedict's manipulation of Sister Elena today. It was Sister Francesca climbing those stairs, her step light with anticipation rather than dread. The sounds that emerged from the tower chamber 20 minutes later left no doubt about the nature of Father Benedict's spiritual instruction. "Dear God," Brother Marcus breathed, his scholarly composure cracking. "How long has this been happening? Months, at least. Perhaps years. Father Benedict has turned confession into a weapon of control. Every woman who enters his confessional becomes either a victim or an accomplice." But it was their final observation that provided the evidence Brother Marcus needed to act with certainty. Hidden in an alcove near Mother Superior's chambers, they witnessed a meeting that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Mother Superior Benedetta sat behind her writing desk, counting gold coins with the efficiency of a merchant. Before her stood a well-dressed man, Isadora recognized as a silk trader from the village, and between them lay documents that bore official seals. "The girl from Florence has proven quite profitable," the trader was saying, his voice carrying the casual tone of routine business. "Young, comely, and grateful for rescue from disgrace. My contacts in Venice have already expressed interest in similar arrangements. We have 2 more who will require placement within the month," Mother Superior replied, sliding additional coins into her purse. "Both from noble families, both carrying complications that make discretion essential." The trader nodded approvingly. "Noble blood commands premium prices. I can arrange passage to distant cities where their origins will remain unknown. Some of my clients prefer women with experience in submission." Brother Marcus gripped Isadora's arm, his face pale with shock and rage. They were witnessing not just the covering up of pregnancies, but the active trafficking of fallen women to brothels and wealthy men who paid for the privilege of owning someone else's shame. "The church hierarchy must be informed immediately," he whispered. "This goes far beyond moral corruption. This is criminal enterprise, conducted under the protection of sacred vows." But as they prepared to retreat from their hiding place, Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Sister Katerina appeared, her pale eyes scanning the shadows with predatory intensity. Behind her walked Father Benedict, his handsome face set in lines of suspicion and barely controlled anger. "Someone has been asking questions," Father Benedict said, his voice low but carrying clearly. "Brother Marcus's research into canonical punishments for clergy is not coincidental, and his assistant has been notably absent from her usual duties. The novice Isidora has always been too curious for her own good," Sister Katerina replied. "Perhaps it is time her curiosity led her to a more permanent form of contemplation." The threat was unmistakable. Isidora felt ice flow through her veins as she realized their investigation had not gone unnoticed. They were no longer hunters gathering evidence. They were prey trapped in an increasingly dangerous game. Brother Marcus squeezed her hand, a gesture meant to convey both reassurance and warning. They needed to escape the convent immediately, before Father Benedict and his accomplices decided that silence could only be guaranteed through more permanent means. But as they crept through the corridors toward the main gate, they encountered an obstacle that changed everything. Sister Francesca stood in the courtyard, her face streaked with tears and her hands pressed protectively over her stomach. Even from a distance, her condition was beginning to show, and her expression carried the devastating recognition of a young woman who had discovered the true cost of Father Benedict's attention. "I cannot leave her," Isidora whispered, watching the girl's obvious distress. "She is barely older than I am, and she has no idea what fate awaits her." Brother Marcus nodded grimly. "Then we must act tonight, before they can silence any of us. The diocesan visitors arrive tomorrow for their scheduled inspection. If we can survive until then, if we can present evidence to authorities who are not already compromised, there may yet be hope for justice." As evening shadows lengthened across the courtyard, Isidora understood that the next 12 hours would determine not just her own fate, but the futures of every woman trapped within the corrupt walls of St. Celestine. The naive novice who had arrived seeking sanctuary was gone forever, replaced by a young woman who would either save the innocent or die trying. The final game was about to begin. The evening bells tolled across the convent with their usual solemn rhythm, but tonight their bronze voices seemed to carry warning rather than comfort. Isidora knelt in her cell, ostensibly engaged in private prayer, but actually listening to the sounds that filtered through the stone walls. Footsteps in corridors where none should be walking, whispered conversations behind doors that should be sealed in contemplative silence, the soft scrape of metal that suggested weapons being readied for purposes far removed from spiritual warfare. Brother Marcus had left the convent at sunset, officially to return to his monastery, but actually to carry word to the diocesan authorities who would arrive the following morning. His departure had been watched by half a dozen pairs of eyes, each calculating how much he might know and how much damage his knowledge could cause. Isidora felt his absence like a physical wound, knowing that she now stood alone against forces that had spent years perfecting their system of corruption and control. A soft knock at her door made her heart leap. "Sister Isidora." The voice belonged to Sister Francesca, barely audible through the heavy wood. "May I speak with you? I am troubled by dreams." Isidora opened the door to find the young novice standing in the corridor, her golden hair disheveled and her violet eyes wide with something beyond simple distress. The girl's condition was more apparent now, the slight rounding of her belly visible even beneath the loose folds of her habit. But it was the fear in her expression that told the real story. "Sister Francesca, you should not be wandering the corridors at night. Mother Superior has strict rules about Mother Superior is busy with preparations for tomorrow's visitors." Francesca interrupted, her voice carrying a bitter edge that had not been there days before. "And Father Benedict is occupied with ensuring that certain sisters understand the importance of discretion." The implications were chilling. Isidora drew the girl into her cell and closed the door, then lit an additional candle to better see her face. What she observed there confirmed her worst fears. The innocent trust that had characterized Sister Francesca's arrival was gone. replaced by the hollow-eyed recognition of a young woman who had discovered the true nature of the sanctuary she had sought. "Tell me what has happened," Isadora said gently, guiding the girl to sit on the narrow bed that served as furniture in the Spartan cell. "I believed him," Francesca whispered, her hands twisting in her lap. "When Father Benedict spoke of special spiritual instruction, of my unique calling to serve God through service to his chosen representatives, I thought myself blessed. When he explained that physical union could be a form of prayer, that my body was a temple to be consecrated through sacred acts, I accepted his teachings as divine truth." The words tumbled out in a rush, each revelation more heartbreaking than the last. Father Benedict had used scripture to justify seduction, had wrapped abuse in the language of mystical experience, had convinced a vulnerable young woman that submission to his desires was submission to God's will. By the time Francesca realized the deception, she was already carrying his child and bound by secrets that could destroy her family's reputation. "But tonight," Francesca continued, "I overheard him speaking with Sister Caterina about arrangements, about a merchant who specializes in finding places for women in delicate circumstances, about convents in distant lands where pregnancies can be concluded quietly and the mothers can begin new lives of service." Isadora felt sick, understanding flood through her. "He plans to sell you, like Sister Magdalena before me, like the others whose names are whispered when the senior sisters think no one is listening. Father Benedict creates scandal, and then he profits from solving it. We are not his victims, we are his merchandise." The brutal clarity of the statement hung between them like a blade. Isadora realized that Sister Francesca had progressed far beyond the need for rescue into the realm of potential ally. The girl's innocence was gone, but her intelligence remained, sharpened now by betrayal and desperation. "Sister Francesca, if you had the opportunity to expose this corruption, to save other young women from the fate that awaits you, would you take it? Even if it meant risking everything you have left?" The violet eyes that met hers were no longer those of a naive novice. "I have nothing left to lose. My family will disown me if they learn of my condition. The church will excommunicate me if they discover the Father. My reputation is already destroyed, my future already sold. But perhaps my disgrace can purchase safety for others." Together, they began to plan. The diocesan visitors would arrive after morning prayers, led by Bishop Alessandro, a man known for his rigid adherence to canonical law and his intolerance for corruption in any form. If they could present him with irrefutable evidence of the convent's crimes, if they could expose the full scope of Father Benedict's manipulation and Mother Superior's complicity, there might yet be hope for justice. But first, they needed documentation, physical proof that could not be dismissed as the fantasies of hysterical women or the lies of disgruntled novices. And Isadora knew exactly where such evidence might be found. Father Benedict's private chambers were located in the administrative wing of the convent, near the rooms where Mother Superior conducted her business affairs. The area was forbidden to ordinary sisters, but Isadora had learned to move through the convent's corridors like a ghost, and tonight that skill would be put to its ultimate test. They waited until the night prayers were complete and the older sisters had retired to their cells. Then, moving with the careful silence of conspirators, they made their way through passages lit only by the occasional torch flickering in its wall sconce. The corridors seemed different at night, filled with shadows that might hide observers and sounds that could signal discovery. Father Benedict's chamber door was locked, but Isadora had anticipated this obstacle. Sister Cordelia's herb room contained more than medicinal plants. It also housed tools for various practical purposes, including a set of delicate metal implements that could coax cooperation from reluctant locks. The skills required were not traditionally taught in convents, but Isadora's youth had been spent in merchant households where such knowledge was occasionally useful. The lock yielded after several tense minutes, and they slipped into Father Benedict's private domain. What they found there exceeded even their darkest expectations. The chamber was furnished with luxury that bordered on decadence. silken hangings that had never graced any monastery, wines that cost more than most families earned in a year, and books that explored subjects far removed from theological study. But it was the contents of Father Benedict's private chest that provided the evidence they needed. Letters from Mother Superior detailing financial arrangements with merchants who specialized in human trafficking, records of payments received for the discreet placement of pregnant sisters, contracts with brothel owners who paid premium prices for women trained in submission and silence. Most damning of all was Father Benedict's personal journal, written in Latin but clearly describing his systematic seduction of novices, his collection of confessional secrets for purposes of manipulation, and his coordination with Mother Superior to transform the convent into a profitable enterprise built on the bodies and shame of vulnerable women. "This is enough," Sister Francesca breathed, her face pale as she read passages that detailed her own seduction alongside those of dozens of other victims. "This will destroy them all." But as they prepared to leave with their stolen evidence, the sound of footsteps in the corridor froze them both. Multiple sets of feet, moving with purpose rather than stealth, voices speaking in urgent whispers. The kind of activity that suggested their infiltration had been discovered. "The window," Isadora whispered, stuffing the most incriminating documents into the folds of her habit. "We can reach the garden and circle back to our cells." But as they moved toward their escape route, the chamber door opened to reveal Father Benedict himself, flanked by Sister Caterina, and two men Isadora did not recognize, men whose clothing and bearing suggested they were not affiliated with any religious order, but rather represented the secular muscle that backed the convent's criminal enterprises. "Sister Isadora," Father Benedict said, his voice carrying the cold fury of a predator cornered by his prey. "How thoughtful of you to gather the evidence of your own heresy in one convenient location. And Sister Francesca, I am disappointed to discover that your gratitude for my spiritual guidance has been so thoroughly corrupted." The trap had been perfectly laid, their investigation had been anticipated, their movements tracked, their capture arranged with the precision of a military operation. As the two secular enforcers moved to block any escape route, Isadora realized that their quest for justice had instead delivered them directly into the hands of their enemies. The game was over, but perhaps, if they were clever and brave enough, they could still change the rules before the final moves were played. Dawn was still hours away when Isadora and Sister Francesca found themselves locked in the convent's punishment cells, stone chambers deep beneath the main building that had been designed centuries ago to house those whose transgressions required isolation and reflection. But tonight, these cells served a darker purpose, holding potential witnesses whose testimony could destroy everything Father Benedict and Mother Superior had built. The evidence they had stolen had been confiscated, of course, but not before Isadora had managed to memorize key passages from Father Benedict's journal and hide one particularly incriminating letter in a place she prayed would remain undiscovered. Their captors believed they had recovered everything, but criminals, Isadora had learned, often underestimated the determination of their victims. Through the narrow window of her cell, she could see the first hints of morning light touching the convent walls. Soon, Bishop Alessandro would arrive with his retinue of canonical lawyers and church investigators. The official visitation would proceed according to schedule, but now it would unfold under circumstances no one could have anticipated. The sound of footsteps on stone stairs announced visitors. Father Benedict descended into the punishment cells, accompanied by Mother Superior, Benedetta, and the two secular enforcers who had captured them. In the dim torchlight, their faces carried the grim satisfaction of predators who had successfully cornered their prey. "The bishop arrives in 3 hours," Father Benedict announced, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "By then, this unfortunate situation will have been resolved in a manner that preserves the reputation of our holy community." "You plan to kill us," Sister Francesca said, her voice steady despite their circumstances. The night had completed her transformation from innocent novice to hardened survivor, and she faced their captors with defiance rather than fear. "Nothing so dramatic," Mother Superior replied, her tone carrying the administrative efficiency that had characterized her rule. "You will suffer tragic accidents, of course, falls from windows during fits of hysteria, drowning while attempting to escape across the river. The kinds of misfortunes that befall young women whose minds have been corrupted by heretical thinking." The casual discussion of murder chilled Isadora's blood, but it also clarified their situation. They had perhaps 3 hours to either escape or find a way to signal the arriving bishop before their enemies could silence them permanently. The odds were impossible, but impossible had become familiar territory for a young woman who had never intended to become either spy or martyr. "Before you dispose of us," Isadora said, forcing her voice to carry calm authority, "perhaps you should know that Brother Marcus was not our only ally. The evidence we gathered was copied and distributed. Your crimes are already known beyond these walls." It was a desperate bluff, but it had the desired effect. Father Benedict's confident demeanor cracked slightly, and Mother Superior exchanged a worried glance with their secular accomplices. In a conspiracy built on secrecy and control, the possibility of exposure from unexpected sources was their greatest fear. "You lie," Father Benedict said, but his voice carried uncertainty now. "Brother Marcus had no time to communicate with anyone after his departure last evening, did he not?" Isadora smiled, putting all her remaining courage into the expression. "A Franciscan monk with contacts throughout the church hierarchy, a scholar who corresponded regularly with canonical lawyers in Rome. You underestimate both his resources and his commitment to justice." The lie was becoming more elaborate, but it was having the desired effect. Their captors were beginning to doubt the completeness of their control, to question whether eliminating 2 novices would actually solve their problems or merely create new ones. As they argued among themselves, Isadora heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Footsteps above, multiple sets of them, moving through the convent with the measured pace of official procession. The bishop had arrived early, perhaps alerted by Brother Marcus's midnight message, perhaps simply eager to complete his inspection duties. "They are here," Sister Francesca whispered, her violet eyes bright with possibility. "The visitors have arrived." Father Benedict cursed, his clerical composure abandoning him entirely. Mother Superior began issuing rapid orders to their accomplices, instructions for covering evidence and ensuring that the official inspection would reveal nothing suspicious. But their greatest problem remained unsolved. 2 potential witnesses whose testimony could destroy everything, and whose disappearance during a diocesan visit would raise questions impossible to answer. "We proceed with the original plan," Mother Superior decided, her voice cutting through the confusion. "Accidents can occur even during official visits, perhaps especially during such visits, when hysterical novices might attempt desperate acts to avoid facing the consequences of their heretical behavior. But as their captors prepared to implement their murderous solution, the sound of heavy footsteps on the stone stairs announced new arrivals. Multiple figures descended into the punishment cells, their torchlight revealing uniforms that belonged neither to the convent nor to ordinary church officials. Bishop Alessandro himself appeared, a stern-faced man whose reputation for inflexible justice had made him both respected and feared throughout the diocese. Behind him came 2 Inquisition officials, their black robes marking them as representatives of the church's most feared tribunal. And flanking them were armed guards whose presence suggested this was no routine canonical inspection. "Father Benedict," the bishop said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute judgment, "Mother Superior, Benedetta, you will explain why 2 novices are imprisoned in punishment cells during our official visitation, and why our investigation has uncovered evidence of financial irregularities, trafficking in human souls, and corruption of sacred vows." Brother Marcus appeared behind the official party, his scholarly face grim with vindicated concern. He had indeed carried word to higher authorities, and his midnight message had transformed a routine inspection into a criminal investigation with the power to destroy everyone involved in the convent's corruption. "Your Excellency," Father Benedict began, his voice regaining some of its persuasive smoothness, "these novices have been spreading heretical lies, making false accusations against their spiritual superiors. Their imprisonment was necessary to prevent further corruption of their sister's faith." But Bishop Alessandro was not finished speaking. "We have examined the documents provided by Brother Marcus. We have interviewed merchants in the village who confirmed their participation in trafficking arrangements. We have discovered financial records that detail the sale of human beings under the protection of sacred vows. The trap that Father Benedict and Mother Superior had laid for their victims had become their own snare. Their system of corruption, built on secrecy and control, crumbled when exposed to the light of official investigation backed by canonical authority. As the Inquisition officials moved to arrest the conspirators, Isidora felt a complex mixture of relief and sorrow wash over her. Justice would be served, but at a terrible cost. The convent of St. Celestine would be dissolved, its residents scattered to other houses or returned to their families in disgrace. The innocent would suffer alongside the guilty, their reputations forever tainted by association with scandal. Sister Francesca reached through the bars of her cell to grasp Isidora's hand. "We did it," she whispered, her voice carrying wonder alongside exhaustion. "We actually did it." "Yes," Isidora replied, watching as Father Benedict was led away in chains, his handsome face now twisted with the rage of a predator finally caged. "But I wonder if we saved anyone, or simply destroyed everything." The question would haunt her in the months that followed, as she struggled to rebuild a life from the ashes of shattered illusions. But in that moment, as dawn light filtered through the punishment cells and freedom beckoned beyond the stone walls, she knew that some choices transcended personal cost. Sometimes, Isidora thought as the guards unlocked her cell door, the only way to preserve faith was to destroy the institutions that had corrupted it. And sometimes, the greatest act of devotion was rebellion against those who claimed to speak for God. The convent of St. Celestine had fallen, but from its ruins, perhaps, something more honest might eventually grow. Epilogue. 5 years later, autumn 1352. The scriptorium of the Abbey of St. Margaret was quiet in the afternoon light, filled only with the soft scratch of quills on parchment and the occasional whisper of pages turning. Isidora sat at her assigned desk, carefully copying a treatise on canon law, her hand steady despite the complex legal Latin that filled each page. Around her, a dozen other sisters worked in companionable silence, their faces bearing the peaceful concentration of women who had found genuine sanctuary in religious life. Sister Margaret, the Abbey's librarian, approached with a letter bearing the seal of the diocesan office. "This arrived for you this morning," she said softly, placing the parchment beside Isidora's work. "From Bishop Alessandro's office." Isidora set down her quill and broke the familiar seal, her heart quickening as she recognized the handwriting of Brother Marcus, now serving as the bishop's personal secretary and chief investigator of ecclesiastical corruption. His letters came regularly, keeping her informed of the ongoing consequences of their revelations at St. Celestine. "Dear Sister Isidora," the letter began, "I write to inform you of recent developments in the trials stemming from our investigation 5 years past. Father Benedict has been formally excommunicated and sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against canonical law. Mother Superior Benedetta died in custody before trial, some say by poison, others claim from shame. The merchants who participated in the trafficking have been prosecuted under civil law, their assets seized to provide restitution for their victims. The news should have brought satisfaction, but Isidora felt only a weary sadness as she continued reading. Justice, she had learned, was a cold comfort to those whose lives had been shattered by corruption, even when that corruption was finally exposed and punished. Of more personal interest, Sister Francesca sends her regards from the convent of St. Clare in Florence, where she has taken permanent vows and serves as teacher to young novices. Her child, a daughter, was placed with a loving family who knows nothing of her origins. Francesca speaks often of your courage and credits you with saving not only her life but her soul. Isadora smiled at this news. Of all the outcomes from their terrible adventure, Sister Francesca's recovery of faith and purpose was perhaps the most meaningful. The young woman who had been so cruelly betrayed had found a way to transform her suffering into protection for others, becoming the kind of mentor she herself had needed during her darkest hours. Finally, I must share news that will perhaps surprise you. The Church has decided to formally recognize your actions at St. Celestine as an example of righteous resistance to corruption. There is discussion of declaring you a candidate for beatification, should you choose to pursue such recognition. Your name is being spoken in Rome as an example of how faith can triumph over institutional failure. The suggestion made Isadora laugh aloud, earning curious glances from her sister scribes. The idea of becoming a saint for acts that had felt like desperate survival rather than holy mission struck her as profoundly ironic. She had never sought recognition, only justice. She had never intended to become a symbol, only to protect the innocent. She folded the letter carefully and returned to her copying, but her mind wandered to the journey that had brought her to this peaceful scriptorium. The Abbey of St. Margaret was everything the convent of St. Celestine had pretended to be, a genuine sanctuary where women could pursue scholarship, spiritual growth, and meaningful service without fear of exploitation or corruption. Here, confession was truly private, authority was exercised with humility, and the vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience were honored rather than manipulated. The abbess, Mother Catherine, was a woman whose wisdom had been earned through decades of faithful service rather than political maneuvering. She had welcomed Isadora despite her notorious past, recognizing that the young woman's experiences at St. Celestine had prepared her uniquely for the work of protecting others from similar abuse. Indeed, Isadora had become something of a specialist in identifying and preventing ecclesiastical corruption. Bishop Alessandro regularly consulted her when investigating questionable religious houses, valuing her ability to recognize the subtle signs of institutional decay that less experienced observers might miss. Her story had become a cautionary tale taught in seminaries, and her methods for gathering evidence had been codified into official investigation procedures. As evening shadows lengthened across the scriptorium, Isadora completed her copying of the canon law treatise, a document that ironically dealt with the very crimes she had helped expose years before. She cleaned her quill and stored her materials with a careful precision that had become second nature, then made her way to the chapel for Vespers. The service was conducted with the simple dignity that characterized all religious observances at St. Margaret. No theatrical mysticism, no manipulation of spiritual longing for carnal purposes, just the honest voices of women offering genuine prayer to a God they served without intermediaries or hidden agendas. After prayers, as the sisters filed out into the gathering dusk, Mother Catherine approached Isadora with a request that had become familiar over the years. Sister Isadora, we have received a letter from the convent of St. Agatha requesting guidance regarding certain irregularities in their administration. Would you be willing to conduct a discreet investigation? The concerns raised are troublingly familiar. Isadora nodded without hesitation. This was her calling now, her way of transforming the trauma of St. Celestine into protection for others. Each investigation was different, but the patterns of corruption remained depressingly consistent. Charismatic leaders who confused authority with entitlement, financial irregularities that funded personal luxury, and always, the exploitation of women whose vulnerability was seen as opportunity rather than sacred trust. I will leave after morning prayers, she said, and Mother Catherine, thank you for trusting me with this work. I know my reputation makes some uncomfortable, The older woman smiled with gentle understanding. Your reputation, my dear sister, is precisely why this work is so important. You have walked through the darkness and emerged with your faith intact. That makes you uniquely qualified to guide others toward the light. As Isadora made her way to her cell that evening, she reflected on the strange path that had led her from naive novice to recognized expert in ecclesiastical corruption. She had entered religious life, seeking escape from scandal, only to discover that sometimes the greatest service to God required confronting the very people who claimed to speak in His name. The window of her cell looked out over the abbey's gardens, where autumn flowers bloomed in defiance of the approaching winter. In the distance, lights twinkled in the village below, marking homes where families gathered in safety and love. The sight filled her with a peace that had been hard-won but was now unshakable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new investigations, new opportunities to protect the innocent from those who would exploit their faith. But tonight, in this sanctuary that lived up to its promises, Isadora offered a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her home. The naive girl who had entered the convent of Saint Celestine was long gone, replaced by a woman who understood that faith was not a shield against the world's corruption, but a sword to cut through it. And in that understanding, she had found not just purpose, but peace. The bells of St. Margaret tolled the hour of rest, their bronze voices carrying across the countryside with serene authority. Unlike the bells of St. Celestine, which had marked time in a place of hidden horrors, these bells sang of genuine sanctuary, honest faith, and the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest circumstances. Isadora knelt for her final prayers of the day, her words simple and heartfelt. She prayed for the victims of corruption still suffering in silence, for the courage to continue her work despite its dangers, and for wisdom to know when justice was more important than mercy. But mostly, she prayed in gratitude for the lesson that had cost her innocence but preserved her soul, that sometimes the most faithful act was rebellion, and sometimes the greatest service to God was saving others from His most dangerous servants. In the quiet darkness of her cell, surrounded by the gentle sounds of a religious house at rest, Isadora smiled and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring new battles in the eternal war between truth and corruption, but tonight she rested in the knowledge that faith, tested by fire, had emerged stronger than those who would corrupt it. The scandals of Saint Celestine were ended, but their legacy lived on in every investigation that protected the innocent, every corruption exposed before it could spread, every young woman saved from the fate that had almost claimed Sister Francesca and so many others. It was not the life Isadora had planned when she first entered religious vows, but it was the life her experience had prepared her for. And in the service of justice disguised as faith, she had found her true calling.